Welcome. Welcome to the New Mexico Museum of Art. My name is Rebecca Aubin, and I'm the head of Education and Visitor Experience here at the museum. I'd like you to raise your hand if you can't hear me. All right, good. Please take one moment to silence your phones before we get going. The New Mexico Museum of Art is working in partnership with the School for Advanced Research to present a series of public presentations honoring our shared history. This year marks the Museum of Art's 100th centennial celebration, and last year was this School for Advanced Research's 110th anniversary, and then this year is the 40th anniversary of the Indian Arts Research Center at the School for Advanced Research. We are thankful to SAR for partnering with us on this program, including Michael Brown, Laura Sullivan, and Nancy Owen Lewis. These presentations are supported by the New Mexico Humanities Council, whose mission is to enhance the civic and cultural life of the citizens of New Mexico. The New Mexico Humanities Council encourages and supports the humanities by seeking out and funding quality humanity programs for presentations to and participation by diverse public audiences throughout New Mexico. Thought, learning, and experience must be shared. This is what it means to be human. We are grateful to the Humanities Council and its principal funder, the National Endowment for the Arts for the Humanities, as well as the sustained commitment by New Mexico Council Board of Directors. Here's a disclaimer. Any views, findings, conclusions, or recommendations expressed in this program do not necessarily represent those of the National Endowment for the Humanities or the New Mexico Humanities Council. So these programs are all related to our current exhibition, Horizons, People in Art in New Mexico. And today, after the lecture, we encourage you to go into the galleries and see the artwork on view. And today is actually free because April 1st was the first Sunday, but we are free to New Mexico residents with ID every first Sunday of the month. And now I would like to introduce Brian Vayo, who will introduce the rest of the program. Brian is a member of the Pueblo of Acoma. He serves as the Director of Indian Arts Research Center at the Research Center for School Advanced Research. With 25 years of experience working with tribal groups throughout the Southwest, Brian also served his own tribal community as Lieutenant Governor. He is the Director of Historic Preservation, Founding Director of the Hadco Museum. His recent work experience extends into the fields of architecture, planning, and the arts. A painter and potter, Brian enjoys experimentation with natural and recyclable materials he discovers on the New Mexico landscape to create mixed media that celebrate aspects of Acoma culture. Brian indicates that his direct involvement during the early years of NAGPRA influenced his work in historic and cultural preservation. He attended the New Mexico State University, where he studied business administration and marketing, and later studied anthropology at the University of New Mexico. Join me in welcoming Brian Vayo.
Guatsihopa. I'm just returning from Acoma Pueblo, where it's very windy. Thankfully, we have stone and adobe homes. But it was quite a racket last evening. Stove pipes, chimneys flying off rooftops. But it's good to be back in Santa Fe this morning. And welcome and thank you for joining us this afternoon for the second segment of this series. I want to thank the New Mexico Museum of Art for this great partnership. We are pleased to join in the 100th anniversary celebration, and are very pleased to have some materials from the Indian Arts Research Collection as part of the Horizons exhibition. We just recently switched out some textiles, so yes, please do visit the exhibit when you have a chance. And as was indicated, we are celebrating our 40th anniversary this year at the Indian Arts Research Center. And this really commemorates the move of the collection into this building that we now occupy. So 40 years later, there's been a tremendous amount of research and collaboration and discussion among many individuals, including those who are part of today's panel. So we're very grateful for this level of interaction and discourse, and we look forward to another 40 years. It's my pleasure to introduce our this afternoon's moderator, Dr. Bruce Bernstein. And I want to see a show of hands of anyone in this room who has not heard of Dr. Bruce Bernstein. None. I didn't think so. So not much of an introduction is necessary, but what I will say is that we've had the pleasure of working closely with Dr. Bernstein. During my brief tenure at SAR, I've learned a tremendous amount from Bruce, and I've always respected his work and his guidance, even while I was still working for my Pueblo in Acoma. As most of you know, Dr. Bernstein's credentials are many. He's a PhD in anthropology, received this from the University of New Mexico, received his undergraduate in American Studies at the University of California, Davis. And Mr. Bernstein currently serves as the director of the Culture and History Project for the Pueblo of Pewaukee, and he also serves as a Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Pueblo. Bruce is also the executive director of the Continuous Pathways Foundation, founded by the Pueblo Pewaukee, and also serves as the executive director and curator of the Coe Foundation. How he gets all this done, I just don't know. But Bruce is working very closely with the Pueblo of Pewaukee, and really, taking a unique approach to thinking about archaeology and its relevance to the Pueblo, and infusing as much as possible the traditional knowledge of the Pewaukee people in this initiative to further strengthen identity, revitalize language, revitalize traditional arts, and other priorities of the Pueblo. And certainly through Bruce's leadership, a lot of this has really taken some pretty great leaps in the short time that he's been with the Pueblo, and since the Pueblo has initiated these important tribal priorities. So I congratulate Bruce on his work there. And as you know, Bruce has been published in numerous publications. Some of the more noted ones would include Rivers Apart, Cochi and Santo Domingo Pottery. And he is currently working on two different publications. One is The Pottery of San Ildefonso Pueblo, which will be published by the Museum of New Mexico Press. And the other, titled Moving Ideas, Staying at Home, Change and Community in 18th Century Tewa Pottery, which will be published by the University of Arizona Press. And in addition to his directorship of research and collections at the National Museum of the American Indian, Bruce has also served as the associate director at the Wheelwright Museum, an assistant curator at the Maxwell Museum at the University of New Mexico, and as the director of the Museum of Arts and Culture here in Santa Fe. So with that, I would like to introduce and invite Dr. Bruce Bernstein.
Okay, just like you, I'm wondering who this person is. There's no doubt about that. So how does this go back on here? So the plan today is this. Fido, how do I get the screen back up? It'll pop up now. Will it? Okay. So the plan today is this. I'm going to introduce the Indian Arts Fund, and I'm going to talk about some of its history and how it came to be. And you'll notice in my discussion of the Indian Arts Fund, there's not going to be very much about potters or pottery. Because what I want to do is I want to show, we're having some technical things going on here. There we go. I want to show some of the development here in Santa Fe and some of the things that people were thinking about in terms of the development. And then I want to bring on the potters, Milford Noho and Russel Sanchez, to really get at how potters and the pots themselves in the collection and what they mean. So I want to tell a story of Santa Fe. I want to tell you the contextualized history of the Indian Arts Fund and what that means to our community here. Because the pots didn't just show up on those shelves at the SAR, but they got there in a certain way. And the thing that I really want to get at with the talk is look at the space in between the pots. What sits between them? How did they arrive in this fantastic, beautiful collection? And I want to be clear about, we're going to talk about pottery primarily today. The Milford and Russel are both potters, although they do many other things with their lives. So we're going to talk about pottery, and I want to make sure you understand that it is about what we call traditional Pueblo pottery. It's a gloss for many different things. It's about something that's deeply embedded inside of people's lives. And it's about harvesting your own materials and mixing those materials. It's about hand building the pots in a coil method. And it's about firing. It's about firing outside, which is exponentially more difficult than taking it to the store. It's not about the trucks that people use. People get all upset that people are using trucks. But that same truck going out to harvest materials in the spot where ancestors, present day, past, and future go, as compared to driving that same truck to the pottery store, is a very different act. So we're talking about people being in that same place. Now, Santa Fe hasn't always been this glorious as it is today, but it did start out in a very different place. Pueblo people, through multiple centuries, were badly treated by every group of people that came here, and people spoke for them all the time. And as a result, when we get to the first part of the 20th century, Pueblo people are at their lowest ebb of population since the arrival of the Spanish in 1598. The communities are shrinking still. The communities would not stabilize and grow again in population until the 1920s, if you can believe that. So over 400 years of really population loss, which was disastrous in many ways for people, besides just losing family, but in terms of the religious societies and the very substance that kept people together. But like other people, a lot of people wanted those metal buckets. They wanted to participate in the manufactured goods in the world. Also, their farmlands and water rights were being badly maligned. So people needed to make some funds in order to live in the world. Americans brought many things to the Southwest, but one of the things they brought most present is a cash economy. People needed money. So people came and they bought things, bought pottery directly from Indians on La Bajada Mountain outside of Santa Fe, and also from the station agent at Buckman. And this is the sort of thing that people purchased. They purchased these small things, these quick things. These are a nickel. They were a dime. If people were really lucky, they got a quarter for it. If they made a bowl that was 6 or 8 inches across, it was $1. Everything was the same price. And people sold by the wagon load. So potters would come into Santa Fe and they would get $2 or $3 for the wagon load. They would not be looked at like, well, I'll take these pots, but I really don't like these so much, but the entire wagon load at a time. So it was a very demeaning sort of time. Now we often hear about the formation of the school and the museum, and they did grow up together. The school was here in 1907, the museum in 1909, 3 years before statehood. They're both very strong and important institutions in Santa Fe. And I know a lot of people care a lot about Edgar Hewitt, and I don't mean to. I had an X through that line originally, then I put a question mark and trying to be nicer about it. Hewitt took a lot of credit for other people's thinking. Hewitt had some original thoughts, but he did not get the nickname El Toro for just any vague reason. His person that really made a difference and changed the way the school, the museum operated, really gave it a place here in the Southwest and in Santa Fe with Native people, was this guy here, this Antonio Peña de Hill, or Waima. He was a cacique, or the headman at San Ildefonso. So when Hewitt goes there in 1907, and he goes to Waima and he says, well, I need some people to come up and excavate with me on the Pajarito Plateau today, which is mostly Bandelier National Monument. Waima was very smart about it, and he sent 3 initiated men. He knew that they would be digging in graves and other places perhaps they should not be going into. And by doing that, it was an interruption of Hewitt's idea about using Indian people. So the Native people, in a way, used Hewitt to help create the museum. And one of the things that Hewitt did while they were up there was he asked Maria Martinez, famously, to make this small little square pot. And making this pot, he gave her a lump of clay from Puye, which is over towards Santa Clara, and he gave her this rock art panel from Sirigay, which is closer to San Ildefonso, and he said, could you put these 2 things together for me? And she did, and she made this small piece that said Museum of Indian Arts and Culture. The other thing that Hewitt was really interested in was returning people to pre-1600, because that would be an era where Indian people were more pure, as if they had never changed until the Spanish arrived, and then they were involved with change over the next centuries. So Hewitt thought by returning them, they would then become more native than they were at that time. I apologize if I'm saying something that offends somebody about this. That's not my intention. My intention is to understand the period of time, how Hewitt thought, as the director of the museum and school, that he could tell Native people how to behave. And so one of the things he asked the people to do on these excavations, the wives of the people, was to replicate. Not to make based on, not the idea of, but to replicate. And so this bowl by Maria and Julian Martinez in 1913, you can see it looks nothing like the bowl on your right. That's right, yeah, the bigger piece. That's the bowl that they had excavated at Ottawa. And so they made the same bowl. But clearly they're people of their time. They're not going to go back in time and make the bowl of some earlier period. Now, let you read that for a moment. One of the things that Hewitt decided on was he wanted his archaeology to come alive. And he actually wrote this. I did not make this up, but he wrote that buried in the debris of time and submerged by foreign influence. That's the way he looked at Native cultures. And he thought through participation in fiestas, the pueblos, which are 9/10 archaeology now, we can catch our archaeology alive at the fiestas through dance and historic pageantry. And these are a couple examples of that. The fiesta starting in the right hand going clockwise. So the Santa Fe Fiesta 1919, Native people were the center of the fiestas. Not the entrada whole idea at all, but people danced. Native people came to town and they danced for about 4 straight days, about 15-minute segments each. So about 4 hours to 6 hours every day, Native people were dancing. So that was the main part of the first fiestas. And then just switching over to the lower left corner, this was another one of Hewitt's idea, the Parade of Progress. And there were 3 cultures for progress. The first was Native people, the second was Spanish, and of course the top of the heap in Hewitt's mind were the Anglos. So he had this, these floats go by, and he's standing facing to the plaza. He's standing in front of the palace on Palace Avenue. He's facing the grandstand set up in the grassy part of the plaza, and that's him on the far left of the photo. And he's narrating this float, and on the float actually is Maria and Julian Martinez. Siana, the opera singer, is also on there, and there's some great museum collections on that float too. And I wanted to point out then this lower right-hand corner, that's the Indian theater. That was his idea of what fiestas should be a permanent part of the town, and that these performers would come in and reenact Indian stories. Not Pueblo people, not Pueblo stories, but Indian stories. On the other side of that is this guy, Kenneth Chapman, who had arrived in Las Vegas, actually, in 1899. And Chapman was a very different type of character. He had studied as an artist. So when Hewitt lost interest in duplicating the pottery. Chapman came along. Chapman was already there, but Chapman took over the project. And as an artist, he was a little more sensitive. So when people said, what should we make? He said, well, make something good. Just do something that you like. I don't want to tell you what to do. Chapman studied pottery from 1901 to 1966. You can see he was the first curator of the Indian Arts Fund from 1922 to 1966. He was instrumental. There are things about his career. Another time asked me what that's all about. But one of the projects he started with funding from Rose Dugan with $300 was the Pottery Improvement Project. And he asked each potter, instead of selling by the wagon load, he asked each potter to set their price. So he would pull out, or they would pull out the 3 best pieces from the wagon load, and he'd say, well, how much? And Maria Martinez, Tanita Roybal, they'd say, well, I want $3 for the 3 of them. And he'd say, I'll tell you what, I'll give you $4 for that one, so 3 times 4, so it'll give you $12 for the 3 if you continue to make this high quality pottery. And so that was a very important step from selling by the wagon load and then differentiated to selling individual pieces. He marked every piece, the flat bottom on the middle on the far right. He put a little bird on the bottom of those pieces. Because how would you know a good pot from a poor pot? So Chapman, the arbiter of good pottery then, would put on the bottom his little sign, a little bird, indicating the pot had come through the Pueblo Pottery Improvement Project. This was something else. So he wrote, actually in 1920, he actually wrote these words about trying to get people to look at their good old designs. Again, the sort of, he was not free of being a man of his time. He certainly was looking at people and saying, you should look at, you should look at your old stuff. I guess I should stop. You should look at your old stuff, and you should look at your old things, your old culture, to tell you in order to form your pottery now. And when he told people to do that, actually it was Maria Martinez who said to him, this is paraphrased, how can we find out what kind of pottery our old people made? There's none of it left in the Pueblo. It is all gone, either worn out and broken, or thrown out with refuse, or is sold to the Americans who buy things because they are old. Since then, he said, so what he did in 1920 is he went around, like these photographs in the upper left, he took photographs of everything he could find in town. And many of those pieces end up in the Indian Arts Fund collection. These are 2 such pieces that end up in the Indian Arts Fund collection. I couldn't remember which ones they are, because I put those arrows in there. And this is a very famous photograph. This is taken in 1966. But this is for the founding members, and that is the famous first pot. You know, in this story, again, this is a story that needs interrogation to understand what goes on, how people talk about things, and how there's an absence of Native people at this point in the story. But this pot, so they go to dinner at Elizabeth Sargent's house in Tasuki, and on the front portal is sitting this broken pot, and it's the Native housekeeper that's broken it. Of course it's the Native housekeeper that's broken it, because she's throwing away her culture, and these white people are going to rescue her. So we need to rethink that story just a little bit and just think about it. They were really sad to see this beautiful thing broken. They began to think about it. Chapman had been working on this for 10 years. Hewitt had worked on it for 20 years. And there was some interest in the Pueblo, too, in terms of being able to generate some economy out of their own pottery. So there's a whole nother story. We can just talk about this, and you can see who the character is. You had to have a houndstooth coat on to sit on that side of the photograph, clearly. And they're sitting in the basement of the museum here. So this is the first pot, again, in that upper corner, and you can see some of the first people. And they basically made it a we're not them organization. That the State Museum, that's Museum of New Mexico, that is Edgar Hewitt, wasn't doing what was right, that he kept looking at archaeology and not living people. And I think they were absolutely right about that Hewitt so much emphasized the past. And this is kind of what the room looked like downstairs. This is, again, down in the basement here. And it was just a little tiny thing. They had very little money. There were envelopes that went out. If you were in an event like this, everybody would get an envelope, and you'd be expected to return them. But Michael's maybe already done that to you. I don't know. But it was very slow going. It was very, very slow going. And in 25, they incorporated themselves, so they had a board of officers and so forth. And this is a very famous story here in Santa Fe. And 1926 is very, very important in terms of a change in the cultural life, the museum cultural life in town. And this is the letter. I've heard often, no one's ever seen the letter. So here's the letter written in John D. Rockefeller's hand. And the letter basically says, I'm going to give you $2,500. How much is $2,500? Chapman was making maybe $1,000 a year. So that was 2.5 years of salary. It was a lot of money. Pots were about $10, $25. So that's a lot of pots that they could buy with that money. Plus, it set up an ability for them to buy those funds. And Chapman just really very modestly writes back to Rockefeller. The story is that Rockefeller came to town. Hewitt was gone, as Hewitt was so often gone. Chapman was assistant director. He showed him around. He showed him around this building, the building across the street, the palace. And the Rockefellers were unimpressed. They then went up to Mesa Verde. And on Mesa Verde, they met this guy, Jesse Nussbaum, the guy who built this building. And Nussbaum said, no, 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 you've got to go back and talk to Chapman and go in the basement of the art museum to see what they're doing. And the Rockefellers had just finished funding Colonial Williamsburg, and they were looking for the next project. And so Chapman took them all around again, and Mrs. Rockefeller sort of stopped him and said, what's down these stairs? Right out here, these stairs. And Chapman couldn't do anything but show them the collection. He brought them downstairs, showed them the collection. The next day, in Chapman's words, he was wedged between Mr. and Mrs. R, and as they drove out to meet Maria Martinez. And then this letter came, obviously, before the Rockefellers left town. They then, from that meeting, built the Laboratory of Anthropology to house and to work with the collection. So these are just a further few dates. And finally, the collection kind of moves around. And finally, in 1931, goes up to the Laboratory of Anthropology. And at the lab, which was built to house the Indian Arts Fund and do a few other things, but principally it was about that Indian Arts Fund collection. That's where it was housed for many, many years until 1962. One of the ways that Chapman always thought about these collections was drawing them. So this pot with the drawing in the pot actually has his pencil marks on them. He grafted it so he could get the components out. And by making drawings of everything, he flattened everything. And then in this San Ildefonso pottery book, he made the mistake of saying, here's a page of body designs, and here's a page of neck designs. Just have at it, have a good time, combine it to make good pottery. But Chapman really enjoyed making those drawings and taught him a lot about pottery. And if you've ever studied pottery and tried making those designs, it's very instructive. This is a page from the catalog book for the Indian Arts Fund, just a beautiful drawings. And these are the actual pots. He really cared deeply for that. He had a WPA project in the 30s to make those drawings. And those drawings, although the fund was set up for people to be inspired by the pottery, what they did with those drawings on these cardboards is they sent them out to the pueblos as examples of good design. And Lupita Chavez made that pot just based on that sort of thing. Indian Market 2 was used for. So in the Indian Market tables in the first Indian fairs were already not new pots, but pots already in the collection, put in to show the potters and the audience what good pottery would look like. This folded up, crappy looking thing on the left is actually the test to be a judge. And they want you to be able to distinguish between the pots. That's what the Indian Arts Fund. Just moving forward now, not a lot changed in the next few years. And in 1955, they established an Indian Arts Fund for Traditional Arts Award for Indian Market. And they weren't able to give it till the following year. They couldn't find a recipient they felt was worthy. And fortunately, they found Lucy Lewis in 1956. And this is Chapman and Lucy Lewis in the basement of the Laboratory of Anthropology. And then in 1962, the Indian Arts Fund collection moved to the Art Museum because of the discussion between the school and the museum, and they're split. That's another day, another collection, another day. In 1972, the Indian Arts Fund voted to dissolve itself and give itself to the School of American Research. It must have been Hewitt flipping in his grave for glee, or maybe fear, who knows which one. And I guess it should be 78 that the Indian Arts Research Center was built and opened. And this is a picture of it as it was opened. So I've gone through all this stuff, and really, what's next? First and foremost, what about reuniting the collection with Native communities and people to better emphasize the meanings of pottery? and to correct some of the inadequacies of the formation and acquisition of the collection. That's what I wanted you to get, and thank you, Julian Martinez, for saying that to you all. He didn't really say that, but I thought it was sort of comical to make him say that. He probably said that to his wife and other members of the village. I think people were around. So in the San Ildefonso collections, in the Indian Arts Fund, there's some 470 or so pots. Only 2 of those were purchased from Native people. And those both were purchased from Julian Martinez. They were older pots that he brought in, and he got more money for those 2 pots than any of the other dealers got for pottery, by the way, which is a nice thing. And it really is, the Indian Arts Fund is really about this intellectual composition, which is of Pueblo people. And some of the ways now that it's beginning to change, and there's really wonderful things going on, is to bring communities in and to have these community consultations. So here's Brian with two people from Acoma. This is actually very recent, and they've been coming in over the last 2 years, and they're working through the collection and reuniting the intellect of people with pottery. And I think that's the most incredible, wonderful thing that can happen. So one of the things, now I want to introduce Milford and Russel Sanchez, and then ask them to come up and just talk have a little chat. And then we're going to go up to the Indian Arts Research Center. If you haven't sign up, sign up, please. It's really an extraordinary experience to walk through the center with them and to hear what they have to say. You know, clearly what's been missing in the presentation is them, and now this is the moment in which we're going to include them. And let's see. I'd like to first introduce my friend Milford Noho from the Pueblo of Zuni. Something I think I've known, but I really found out looking for pottery to illustrate here, is that a Milford-made pot like one person is very difficult to find. It's easy to find Nahohai pieces because the family's always working collaboratively. I'm sure Milford someplace has made one pot start to finish all by himself, but it probably turned out they went to dig the clay together or something like that. So it really represents that sort of traditional way that things go on. And Milford is a virtuoso in terms of his ability in the technical aspects, knowing the clays and the paints and so forth. It's really wonderful talking about that. He's also a man deeply immersed in his Pueblo, in his Zuni culture, and he teaches that through his pottery. Now, Milford's first memory of pottery is drinking from a clay container that his mother made. And then he began making pottery in the 1980s. And as his mother, Josephine, was getting more and more requests for pottery, he helped her out. Milford says there was really nothing, you know, he'd done nothing about art his entire life. He didn't go to art school or anything like that. But he just started helping her. And that's how he got to it. And he also is an author of 2 books, by the way, and he spent over a decade at Zuni Arts and Crafts Enterprise, which was an internationally renowned business. And then the first museum collection he ever saw is the Indian Arts Fund. And he traveled there, he says, at the Indian Arts Research Center, we got to see all those pots taken out of Zuni in the 1800s. Much of Milford's pottery is collaborative first, and this is end of quote, and much of Milford's pottery, as I said, is collaborative, particularly with his mom first, and then his brother Randy next, and now with his nephew JC. And he says that some of the other Pueblos see pottery making as a female art, but it's not like that in Zuni. Growing up, he had a grandfather born in the 1800s, and to this day he regrets not asking him more questions, particularly because he spent time going to white schools and being assimilated into white culture. But he said, through the clay, I found myself becoming a Zuni again. I think I did it through my pottery. And this very famous photo, with the help of their friend Jim Osler, he helped write a grant to bring Josephine and family and friends to the Indian Arts Research. It was the first Catherine Lamont fellowship there, and they spent a lot of time with it. And the purpose was to acquaint them with the old pottery as well as acquaint the larger world with Zuni pottery itself. And in this picture, as you can see, it's Rose Jasper, Josephine Nahohai, and Eloise Westica. And this photograph captures this moment when the collection staff had stepped out of the room, and they decided to take matters in their own hands, and they put the pots on their head as they had done hundreds of times. I mean, so we're talking about preservation, right? We're talking about this collection. What better preservation than to put the collection back in use, right? I mean, this photograph is so wonderful for so many different ways. These women had danced with pots on their heads so many different times. And Milford says, the director, who was, who'll go unnamed right now, Milford, was a white guy. Milford said he was a white guy, and he turned whiter than everyone he ever saw them. Next person is Russel Sanchez. The other person is going to come up in a moment on the stage. And Russel's from San Ildefonso Pueblo, and he learned to pot from his maternal great-grandmother, Rose Gonzalez, who is down in this lower corner here. He also sees some of the examples of what he can do. He's also brought up by his grandfather, Abel Sanchez, who was a very important leader in both in his own village as well in the Pueblo community, and a great artist as well. And he continues to surround himself today with unique aesthetics of his home village in every facet of his life. And he's been unselfishly helping Indian market for a long, long time. And he comes and he looks at every pot that's entered and says, this one's not fired right, this is store-bought clay, they used a buffing wheel with wax on this one. So, because part of Indian market is that people are using traditional pottery when they're in the traditional pottery categories. People with the wax, they can go in the non-contemporary, they can go into contemporary, non-traditional categories, but people need to be straight up about that. And now he's on the board. That's his reward for working all the years. They've asked him on the board. And in his most recent award, he's a multiples of Indian Market Awards, but last year he was named New Mexico Governor's Award of Excellence, a well-deserved honor. Russell tells the story that when he was about 11 years old, he had a batch of black pots sitting out in front of the house. Anita Day, Popovy Day's widow at the time, came by and said, I really like those, I'll take them all. Keep making pottery. He took that just as she said it and has kept making pottery. He's about 11 years old at that time. And the best tools, when he's at the Indian Arts Research Center, one of his favorite tools is to use his phone. And this is some of the work that we've recently been doing in looking at the older pottery in preparation for this book and exhibition, and just showing you what shows up from these pots. You know, these designs get used over and over again, and it's very important that they do get used again and again because they have deep cultural meaning. But Russell makes them his own, and I think that's very important. You'll take a look at what other potters are doing, but it's always his own. There's no mistaking that Russell made this pot, and the pot he's holding is made by Tanita Roybal. And he talks about the word and the work of tradition is so misunderstood. He describes tradition as is told to him, take what I do, but make it your own. And I think that's really his sort of guiding essence of what pottery is. And he's also an advocate for making pottery in the Pueblo way, as I've described. Really a marvelous potter. You can see some of the ways that he's looking at designs. I had him go around the room the other day and just point to some of the inspirations for his current work. And there's some more inspiration. Maybe this is a little easier to see in terms of the squash, not a melon, but a squash shape. He doesn't have the picture of the squash to show you why it's a squash shape. But that squash shape on the far right is a pot made by Nicolasa Pina, that's Maria's sister, and an important pot in the collection. And then looking at that and creating that. And then he really loved these dots on the pot on the far left upper. And he really loved those dots inside other design elements. So he started using those dots as well as the dots that Tanita Roybal liked to put on her pottery. And then he's holding a wide, a blackware piece with a wide rim, which he's duplicated on this pot. And this tall lid on this Florentino and Martina Montoya pot, he's duplicated on some pots too. That's not the clearest picture, you have to take my word for it on that. So now, I'd like to ask Russell and Milford to come up. You guys are gonna change the lights somehow. And we'll have a little round table about, and hear from them about pottery. Russel Sanchez, if you don't know Russell, again from the Pueblo of San Ildefonso. And Russell and I have been collaborating, and one of the things that Brian mentioned, that one paper, Russell's a collaborator on. And it all stems from him. I asked him a question, and Russell said to me, well, duh. it's amazing what you can learn when you listen, I guess. And Milford Noho from the Pueblo of Zuni, and he's brought his own drinking cup, as you can see, with a special flavor of water. So thank you both for coming today. I just wanted to start, I've got sort of some questions, but I thought we might begin by each of you telling us a little bit about your first visit to the Indian Arts Fund collection, and kind of what your impressions are, what you took away, what you saw, what you felt like the first time. Milford, you want to go first on that?
Well, Keshi Konatanaka. The first time our family came into the School of American Research was around back in the 1980s. My mom got a grant from the school, and she got the grant to teach or to continue her pottery making. Because back in the Pueblo, there were potters. It was trying to be revived, but more or less the schools were doing it, and they were using commercial clay, commercial paints, and stuff like that. And my mom didn't really want to see that part being lost, so she got the grant. And so when we first came up, it was a big thing for us, going into the room and being able to look at the pots and actually, holding the pots. And then, of course, as a potter, you always want to check inside to see the thickness and how you had done the coiling and everything like that. And so it was very good when we first came up, because when I got started, we're helping my parents out with the pottery. Basically, well, the first thing also was like, my mom was doing her pottery, and she learned it from her mom and various other ladies in the Pueblo. And then, but then most of the designs that my dad and my mom were using were what we call the deer in his house design. And those were basically what I found out were mostly from the 18th century designs. And then, like, I heard that two stories were how that design came, and there were two stories from non-Zuni members, and I didn't really like the hearing of the explanation of design. So I didn't really, well, like, for me, I didn't really use the deer in his house design. I was, I was more or less helping my mom out with her bowls, what we call the cornmeal bowls. The ones with the terraces. Awitaba means terraces, or the cloud bowls. So I was helping her out with that. But once we got to the museum, that's when we started noticing all these new designs that were for us, a lot of geometrics and figurative types. And so that's what sort of like blew our mind. And after our first initial visit to the museum, once we got back home, we said we have photographs and stuff that we got for ourselves, and we started utilizing those the designs. And then I was working for the Pueblo Zuni Arts and Crafts at that time, and then my boss was Jim Osler, and that's what he noticed too. Like, it seemed like after your first initial visit to the museum, that's when you started doing away with the deer in his house design, and you started coming up with all these designs. And so that's what blew his mind too. So that we started, it helped us out a lot.
Thank you. Thanks, Milford. Russell, same sort of thing, your first time in the collection, your sort of impressions of that?
I was maybe 15 or 16, and as Bruce said, I was working with Anita Day by that time, and she was working a lot with Richard Spivey. So they took me up there and said, you got to see these things. And when I saw it, I was just in awe. And at that point, I decided I wanted to stick with traditional materials techniques, because there was so much that could be done with it. I mean, if you look at the history of pots from San Ildefonso, you see so many different styles develop within a short period from that limited source of materials. Just the designs, the shapes, and that's where I'm working for now. And since then, I've been up there several times, and each time I go, I see something new. I can look at the same pot 10 times, 20 times, and you see so many different elements. And I'm taking those same elements and reincorporating them into my work today. And one thing that we were always told at the Pueblo is that this is what I do, take it and make it your own. Meaning, don't directly copy something. To keep our tradition alive and our styles alive, we have to keep evolving with it. And everybody has their own interpretation of a certain design. Some designs are meant for ceremonial use, others are meant just for fun. Potters were enjoying themselves and having fun. So that's my experience there. But I totally enjoyed it. It's a pleasure to be up there all the time. And as Bruce will tell you, every time we go up there, it can be for half an hour, but it ends up being that much time.
So I was just, the collection is primarily historic, and I'm just wondering if you would just share a little bit about what it feels like to be in a room filled with your community's pottery. Either one of you can start to, but what does it feel like for you as a Zuni person to be in a room surrounded by all those historic things, people from a previous time?
Well, for me, it felt good because, like I said, there was a lot of designs that we had never used before or never seen before. And so just looking at all the variety of the design, not only the designs, but the shapes that we saw that weren't being used anymore. Like the type of pottery that my mom was making was sort of like the basic water jars that were sort of like common with all the pueblos. But after looking at all the collections over there, and then also starting, looking at other collections in different museums, I started seeing that Zuni had a big history of ceramics. There was all different shapes of the pot, the water jars, and different types of bowls. And it seemed like each bowl had a function, or there was certain things that were on it for a functional use. And that's one thing about pottery, about Zuni pottery, that I liked about it. Not only is it decorative, but it's still functional. The pottery that we still make today is still functional.
So Russell, the same sort of question about being amongst all those pots and people from the village. And I'm just wondering too, so when you make pots, does it change the way when you're at home, working on pottery? Does it change something about that?
Yeah, it does. To me, when I see that, it makes me feel like I'm at home. And I can relate a lot to the potters that did it back then. Certain things that the old people would tell us. See, I was lucky. I grew up at home. I grew up in a traditional home in a traditional way. I learned my native table language first before I spoke English and other things, and that's just how I was brought up. So I can see what we were told, what we were talked to, and when you touch those pots, you can just feel the people that made them talking back to you. It sounds corny, but it is true. It's like I'll be building a pot from trying to get these old shapes where they really flare out, and somebody in Tewa will be talking to me and telling me how to do it to push it out more. Some other potters wonder, well, how can you do that? It's like, I don't know. It's just like them coming into me and showing me, telling me what to do. So I love being there, and I love being around the old arts, and it just makes me feel happy and feel good. And to me, when I'm potting, it's not really work. For me, it's relaxing. It's enjoyable. That's how I relax with work.
Same here.
I'm wondering, Milford, if you would be willing to talk a little bit about your mom, Josephine, and what her reaction was, to seeing things, that here in Santa Fe, in this locked room, are all these pots from Zuni, but you're put them on your head and dancing around and having a good time. So I'm just wondering if you, again, talk about some of the emotion of what your mom shared with you about her emotion, and yours as well about that.
Well, I knew that, just trying to think about it, I knew that she experienced a lot of, joy and, like seeing all the pottery that was there. And I guess it reminded her of her childhood too, because her mom was a potter too. But I guess, like the thing that she liked to do was just go around to the pots, and we were actually allowed to touch the pots, not with gloves or anything like that, because that's one thing I started seeing was when we went to different museums, they will let us put on white gloves, and we had, that's how we handled the pots. But when we were at the school, they didn't do that, because when you have something between your hands and you're touching it, the connection isn't there. So I think with my mom, she had a big pride in seeing the old work. I don't know if she recognized any of some of the old work, but she made comments about some different designs that she was seeing. And then I remember, use this part of the design that my mom would use, and then stuff like that. And then besides going to the SAR, one of the places that we went to visit was in Washington. And when we went to the Natural History Museum, we were in that one area, and she started looking at some of the other, I think, dioramas that were around there, and I went a little further. And then next thing that I remember was that she started calling my name, Gautami. So I went over there, and she was standing in front of a showcase, and there was her pot inside. And she was all happy about it. And she said, I feel proud to have my work underneath glass, especially we just walk on the clay. And so she said it made her proud to see her, see her work finally being recognized like that.
Thanks.
I grew up around pottery, and to this day at home, we still use pots for a lot of our ceremonies, our dances, and our daily life. And it's kind of the same thing that he said. When these people see these pots, they get so emotional, and they can connect to it. Because the way we describe a pot, it's like a living person. You have the base, which we call the butt, the body. If it's a double shoulder, the breast, the lip, the mouth. And so people ask if we get upset when a pot cracks or something. We say no. It's the spirits that wanted the pot, so they take it home with them. When people die, we bury them with pots. We don't look at the monetary value of a pot, but we look at what joy it's going to bring them to take them to the next life, to the next place they're going. So we're constantly using them. And like I said, to us, they're a living thing, and we care about them. And I think that's why people take joy in building a pot. And when somebody else sees a pot, a collector or just anybody, they look at a pot and they do this, and they're like, oh, they can feel that energy coming from the piece. And you can just tell, that it's a living thing.
I'm wondering, Milford, both of you, but let's start with you, Milford, that you and Randy, you and your mother have gone to Auditorium many years and taught. And I'm just wondering about the process of teaching Zuni pottery to non-Zuni people. And we're talking a little bit about the emotional side of pottery. So what essence, when you're teaching people who maybe don't know anything about your village, your culture, what essence do you try and get across to people in teaching?
Well, let's see, I think, not only when I teach pottery, I talk about, our village, different things, like the different things that we go through in making pottery. And it's just not, teaching them the techniques. We tell them all the different stories that are involved in making, making the pots. And then to me, the more like stuff that you're able to tell the outside, the more they get a grasp of it, the less ignorance there is. It seems like they know a lot more, because we have been going to shows and selling our pottery in different areas, and then sometimes people would make a remark about the price of the pots, that much for a mud, piece of mud, or stuff like that. But like once we started teaching, and we teach them like what the whole process is involving in making the pottery, because you have to go get the clay and everything like that. Just like when my mom got the grant, on the first day that it was announced in the Pueblo that my mom was going to be teaching pottery, we had a whole bunch of ladies come over to the house, and they were merely thinking that Mom was just going to come out with the clay, put it at the table, and says, "Here,
Take it.
this is how you make a pot. Show you how to form it." But that's what they were expecting. But we told them, but she said, in order for you to learn how to make pottery or keep this tradition going, you have to go out to where the clay sites are, learn where the clay sites are, learn the proper purrs and everything like that. So that day we took about 4 truckloads of the ladies going up to the mesas, and we told you, we went down to get the clay. We set the purrs first and then got the clay, and then after maybe part of the afternoon, or we went back home, and then we unloaded the clay, and then the following day, only about 4 people showed up. We, later on, I asked the ladies, the ones that didn't come back, how come you didn't come back? Says, "Oh, we didn't know it was going to be this much of work. We thought it was just going to be your mom providing the clay and then teaching us how to build, and that will be it." Says, "That won't be like my mom said. I won't have been teaching you anything. The thing you have to do is learn where the clay sites are, learn the proper prayers, because there's a lot of prayers that are involved in the making of pottery, and that's what we're still doing today."
It's the same with me. I agree with him. When you get somebody new that wants to start a pot, I'll always start them with the culture first. It's very important to me that you learn the culture. Like I said, I grew up Tewa, so that's something that's inside me. But a lot of potters today, I hate to say it, don't really know much about their culture or religion or where they're from. And to me, I think that the pots that you're doing should represent the area you're from. And you should have your culture and your pueblo behind what you're producing. When we go out for clay, it's the same thing. We dig, we take food, we take water. We offer it to the people that have gone before us to bring to the clay mother, to ask their hands to help us. When we're polishing a pot, when we're building a pot, we invite them. In our language, it means come, bring your hand, share with us, show us what to do, help us along the way. And the same with firing. We pray to the ash woman to bring her fire, to bring everything and make sure the pots come out. And then at that point, if a pot cracks or breaks, we don't get that disappointed. We just say, "Oh, well, they wanted it. It's theirs. Let them take it." So then we'll take that piece out and offer it to them, give it back to them. But culture is very important to me in doing what I do. And again, it goes back to not being stuck in a certain time period, because that's not what tradition is about. Tradition's supposed to be growing and ongoing and ongoing. And if you want to keep your traditions alive, you have to bring them into the now. You can't stay stagnant, because then that's where everything dies.
So Milford, I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit about Zuni. So as Randy, and particularly your brother Randy, started changing and changing design, maybe going back further in time to look for inspiration, I'm just wondering if you could talk a bit about the Zuni's reaction to what was going on at your house.
Well, at first they were all wondering, what is he smoking? Because, like I said, the pottery that when we started was basically the design that we kept using was the deer in his house design. But then we, of course, working with pottery and going to the museum, we started meeting a lot of various people, non-natives that had knowledge in the historical pottery. And one of them is here today. And she commissioned my brother to do a bowl. And when my brother finished that bowl, she gave a copy of the Frank Hodges report, the excavation of Hauiku. Hauiku was the first village that we had the first European contact. And when they excavated that area, there were numerous shapes, designs, styles of pottery that was excavated over there. And then when my brother got that book, in the back was all those black and white drawings of the designs that were excavated and everything like that. And he just went crazy with all those designs. And then one of the things also was like, when he started using those designs, like I said, people were wondering, he's just making things on his own, or he's not really doing what traditional pottery should look like, because most majority of the people in Zuni didn't really know what the historical designs look like, but he just continued making. And then there was a show that was sponsored over at the Flagstaff at the Museum of Northern Arizona. After, I don't know, when Randy first got involved with the Hawiku designs, not just only Hawiku designs, but there was designs that came from, we had 6 different villages. There was designs that came from Hawiku, Matsaaka, Pingawe, Ketchipawe. It seemed like each village had their own designing, but those weren't being used anymore. And so like when the Flagstaff Museum put on that show, I think it was titled like something dealing with Hawiku, like reflections from Hawiku. But before they did that show, they made Xerox copies of the designs that were in that booklet. And then they gave it to the other potters and then jewelers. And then so some of the jewelers started using those designs. And when we got to the show, majority of some of those jewelers came over and started talking with us, and they said, now we understand the designs that you are using. But the thing was that year when they were doing the reflections of Hawiku, Randy didn't make any Hawiku style pottery. He was already in a different area.
Thanks. Russell, same sort of question. I'm just wondering how San Ildefonso and the other potters react to your pots. Sometimes they're quite different, or they look different. I'm just wondering how your own community reacts to your pottery.
Reaction has been great, very supportive and great, and more people are getting interested again. Again, going back to that saying of, this is what I do, take it and make it your own. Not replicating everything from the past, but using the elements from the past to make it how you feel today, your personal expression. As you can see from the potters of the late 1800s, 1900s, at San Ildefonso, they came up with, 8, 9 completely different styles with the same exact material. Even today, we all have our own interpretation of a water serpent, each family. Nobody has the same horn, nobody has the same tail or the same lightning bolt coming out. Same with a feather design, or same with the polychrome designs I'm using. I get inspired from there, but I take those elements and I make them mine. And still today, that's what potters are told at home. Be inspired by our past, but bring it into the now so you can relate it to the people of today. Not to be stagnant and not to be replicating what's been done, but keep it going and keep your tradition alive.
Yeah, like my brother said, like the pottery that he started doing, he said he was starting to give him a facelift. But it seemed like, we just started, now I think the Pueblo now sees what we are doing with our pottery, because we're always we're always pushing it, using different shapes. And now my nephew here, JC, he's experimenting with a lot of different colors that weren't available at that time, but because of me doing a lot of traveling and working with the Pueblo, I did a lot of traveling, meeting a lot of not only just native potters, but potters from the different areas, like in Japan, Australia, and every place like that I go to. I always, since they find out like I'm a potter, they're always willing to share like some of their materials with me, and they give me some of that material, and I bring it back, and then I incorporate it into our use. So now we have a lot of different colorations and different, glaze, not really glazing, but different colors of pigments that that we use now, that we sometimes give out to some of the members of the community, and that's how we share now.
So just a couple more questions from my prepared list here, and then I'll ask you all if you have some questions for the two of them. But I'm just wondering now, Russell, is there anything in the collection, the Indian Arts Fund collection, that surprises you?
No.
No.
Like I said, I'm just amazed at what they can do, but I'm not surprised by what they could do. They really pushed themselves, and
Beautiful.
They got incredibly, incredibly creative.
Uh-huh. So when
and when I look at what I do, I'm humbled by what they were able to do with such limited materials. I mean, they pushed it so far.
Yeah. So
the size of the pots, the scale, the design, the colors.
So in that humbling that you have when you're inside the collection, is that what's pushing you forward at this point?
That's what's pushing me, their inspiration. And I want to make them proud. Using them and, you know, carrying on what they're doing.
That's beautiful, thank you. And same question, Milford, I don't know if anything just took you totally off guard when you first went to the collection, or you'd seen it all by then? That was, what the heck?
No, I think it was just an introduction to the designs and the shapes that we have been using before, and ditto to what Russell was saying.
I just want to ask you both, what can the Indian Arts Fund do? What can Brian and his programs, School for Advanced Research do? What can they do more? What's the next steps? You know, I've tried to set it up today in the sense that these white people did all these things, they got the collection together, but in these last decades, it's really begun to open up more to Native people, and I think under Brian's guidance, it's going to open more. So if you were talking directly to Brian, which you can, he's sitting right here, but I'm just wondering, what would you see, what would you see as more? What could it do more to help?
I would say to encourage a lot of these younger potters to listen to their elders more, to learn their language, to learn their cultures, their ceremonies, because all that goes into the work that you're creating. You forget the old ways, then you forget the beginning of these traditions. You don't have that, you really don't have anything to fall back on.
That's good.
I mean, you can go out and make something, but it's not going to have that same feel. And you can't say, well, this is what inspired me, this is where it came from. I think that's very important as a traditional potter to do that. Because like I said, for tradition to survive, you have to be inspired by something. And innovation is part of tradition. It's always been, as you can see from all the pots up there.
That's right.
They came from something from someplace. So for them to continue to grow and move on, you have to have that, I feel.
Let's see.
You can think about that.
I would say probably, you know, like what they're doing now, like having the collections more accessible. But I don't know if there's any more Zunis that are coming out to utilize that utilize those pieces over there. But I would like to see more people from our village coming over there and utilizing the collections. Make it, you know, not only for them, if you're able to, you know, like not just having them come out to Santa Fe, but somehow do a traveling thing or somehow doing something at the Pueblo.
Another thing you can do is let me take home like 100 of those pots and live with them for several years.
I think you're gonna have to wait in line to take them home. One last thing, and then I really would love to have some questions from you all. But one of the things that both Milford and Russell have talked around is the current state of Pueblo pottery, and that it has it's reached a sort of point where a lot of potters will compromise and do things a little bit differently, not the way in a traditional way, let's just say, because it's about money now. It's about an individual, perhaps about making money. It's not about keeping the community alive. And over the past 10 years, particularly Russell and I have worked a lot on this idea of how to maintain some space for pottery in our world of Santa Fe, in the world of the communities. And I don't know if you want to say anything more about how you see the future, you know, how you see the Indian Arts Fund helping with that, how you see our audience helping with that. But there's certainly these things that happen that I know you're both very vocal about, and I just wonder if you want to comment on that.
Well, I don't know, but I mean, I see a lot of beauty in a lot of the non-traditional work that's being produced, but for me personally, it's important for me to go out to dig my clay, clean my clay, ask for the clay, go out hiking, which I normally do anyway, and finding a lot of the slips and clays that were used in the past. Like I said, I'm lucky because I grew up with a table language, so a lot of these old people told me where the locations are, and they tell me in Tewa, not in English, so I know where they're coming from, and I can go get them. And I wish a lot of these younger potters will put in the hard work that it takes to get to that point. Because before you can make a pot, as he said, you have to do all these other things, which I feel are very, very important.
Same.
Still.
It's different, and you have so much more respect for the clay and the firing process and the building process when you go through the work of doing it and you see how difficult it is. And then it doesn't become difficult, it becomes fun. And you appreciate it.
Thank you very much. We appreciate spending part of your Sunday with us.